The Wyoming plains don't warn you. They don't send signals or give you time to prepare. One morning the sky is pale and still, and by afternoon the world has become something unrecognizable. Vast, howling white that erases everything familiar and replaces it with nothing. No landmarks, no horizon, no mercy. Just wind that cuts through every layer a man owns, and cold that doesn't just touch the skin, but reaches inward, settling into the bones like it intends to stay. That was the winter of 1887, and on a forgotten trail miles from the nearest town, in the middle of all that white and all that silence, a broken wagon sat half buried in a ditch. One wheel was splintered to nothing. The wood had cracked and warped. The canvas covering had long since torn away and disappeared into the storm. What remained was barely a skeleton, a few boards held together more by ice than by anything the carpenter had intended. And beside it stood a boy. He was small, painfully, terribly small against that landscape. His coat was torn at both shoulders, stiff with snow that had frozen into the fabric and refused to leave. His boots were a man's boots, his father's boots, 3 sizes too large, tied at the ankle with strips of torn cloth just to keep them from pulling free with every step. His hands were bare. His fingers had passed through pain some hours ago and arrived somewhere beyond it, a numb, distant place where they moved when he told them to, but felt nothing at all. He had been standing here for 3 days. His name was Noah Briggs. He was 6 years old, and he was not going to move. Because just behind him, resting on the frozen ground, sheltered on 3 sides by boards he had pulled from the wreckage himself, was a small wooden crate lined with every blanket that remained. And inside that crate, wrapped in layers that had long since lost their warmth, a small baby girl made small, exhausted sounds that were barely cries anymore. They were something quieter than cries, something more desperate, the sounds of a body fighting to stay present in a world that was doing everything it could to push it away. Noah dropped to his knees beside her, the snow crunching beneath him. He brushed the newest drift away from the blankets with hands he could not feel, the way he had done it 100 times already. "I'm here, Emma." His voice was almost nothing, a thin thread of sound in all that wind. "I'm right here. I ain't going nowhere." Emma stirred faintly beneath the blankets. Her eyes didn't open, but her chest rose, fell, rose again. And Noah let out a breath he had been holding since the last time he checked. He pressed his forehead gently against the edge of the crate, just for a moment, just long enough to feel something solid. 3 days ago, they had still been a family. His father, Robert Briggs, had been a quiet man, the kind of man who showed love through doing rather than saying, who fixed things before you noticed they were broken, who always seemed to know which way was north. He had been guiding the wagon south ahead of the storm, pushing the horses hard, trusting his own experience and the strength of the animals he knew well. Noah had been sitting up beside him on the driver's bench, watching the way his father's jaw was set and his eyes were focused on the distance. And even then, even with the wind rising and the sky turning that particular shade of pewter that meant nothing good, Noah had not been afraid because his father was there, and his father had never let anything happen to them. His mother had been in the back, holding Emma, humming, that low, steady hum she always used when Emma was restless, a sound without words, just warmth made into melody. Noah had turned back once to look at her, and she had caught his eye and smiled, and in that smile was everything: safety, warmth, the absolute certainty that the world was fundamentally all right. He wished he could unknow that smile now, because remembering it cost him something every time. Then the wood snapped. Not a creak, not a warning, a sharp, violent crack that came from beneath the wagon and traveled up through the boards and into his bones. The horses screamed, a sound unlike anything Noah had ever heard, a sound he would hear in his sleep for years to come. The wagon lurched hard to the right, tilted, held for one sickening moment at the edge of balance, and then went over. Then silence. When Noah opened his eyes, the world was wrong. The sky was where the ground should have been. Snow was in his mouth, his ears, down the back of his collar. He lay still for a moment, too stunned to move, listening to the wind and the distant sound of the horses and something else, something he couldn't identify at first. Then he realized nothing. His father was not moving, not speaking, not making any sound at all. He lay in the snow a few feet from the wreckage, face turned to the sky, and there was a stillness about him that was different from sleep, a stillness that was complete and final, and that Noah's 6-year-old mind could not yet fully name, but understood in some deep, wordless place beneath thought. His mother was alive, barely. She had curled around Emma during the fall, thrown herself over the baby with every instinct she had, and Emma was unharmed. But his mother's breathing was wrong. It came in shallow, careful increments, as though each one required a decision. She reached for Noah with one cold hand, found his face, pressed her palm against his cheek. Her eyes found his. "Take care of her," she whispered. That was all. That was everything. 4 words that landed on a 6-year-old's shoulders like the weight of the world, and somehow, impossibly, held. By morning, she was gone. Noah didn't cry, not the way you might expect. He sat in the snow beside her for a long time, very still, very quiet, the wind moving his hair, and Emma crying softly nearby. And then something settled in him. Not peace, not acceptance, but something more like a door closing. A door closing on everything that had been, and the one remaining thing on the other side of it making itself known. Emma needed him. So he moved. He dragged the crate from the wreckage with hands already going numb. He gathered the blankets, every one he could find, however damp, however thin. He wrapped his sister with the care and precision of someone who understood that each tuck of fabric, each layer, each small decision mattered absolutely. He built a windbreak from the boards he could move. He found a stick in the debris. He couldn't have told you why he picked it up. He just knew that Emma was behind him, and that meant something had to stand in front. He ate almost nothing. There was a little dried food in the wagon's compartment, and he found it on the first day, and he gave Emma what she could take and ate the smallest possible amount himself, enough to stay standing, not enough to feel anything close to satisfied. He melted snow in his cupped hands for water, a process so slow and so painful that he began to understand in a new way what the word patience truly meant. At night he did not sleep. He sat beside the crate with the stick across his knees, listening, counting Emma's breaths in the dark, watching the black sky above the Wyoming plains burn with cold stars that offered light but no warmth. Talking to her in a low, steady voice, not because he thought she could understand, but because the sound of his own voice kept him awake, kept him present, kept him tethered to the world when the cold and the exhaustion pulled at him like deep water. "You're okay," he told her, over and over. "You're okay. I'm here. I ain't leaving." By the 3rd day, he was beyond tired. He was beyond cold. He existed in a strange, narrowed state where thought came slowly, and the world beyond the crate had reduced itself to something abstract and unimportant. What mattered was the rise and fall of Emma's chest. What mattered was the sound she made. What mattered was the space between her last breath and her next one, that small, terrifying gap that he measured with his whole body every time, waiting for it to close. He was standing beside the crate, the stick in both hands, staring at the empty trail through the blowing snow, when something moved. A shadow, a shape that didn't belong to the landscape. Then hoofbeats, slow, heavy, real. He raised the stick. The rider came through the storm the way things appear in dreams, gradually resolving out of white and wind into something solid. A man on a dark horse, tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat so thick with snow it had turned nearly white itself. He rode with the unhurried steadiness of someone who had spent his whole life outdoors, who had learned long ago that panic costs more than it buys. His name was Caleb Turner. He was 41 years old, and he had been alone for 6 of them. His wife, Margaret, had died of fever in the winter of 1881. They had not had children, not for lack of wanting, but for lack of time, and then, suddenly, for lack of her. He had buried her on the east side of the property, where the morning sun came first, and he had gone on living the way men go on living when they don't quite know how to stop, through work, through routine, through the daily discipline of a ranch that demanded his attention, whether his heart was in it or not. He was not an unhappy man, but he was an empty one. There's a difference. He had been riding back from a neighbor's property when the storm thickened beyond what was wise. He knew this trail. He had never expected to find anything on it. He had almost ridden past the wreckage before his horse slowed on its own. Animals notice things before men do. And he looked down from the saddle and saw the broken wagon, and then the crate, and then the boy. He stepped down from his horse, and Noah stepped in front of the crate. "Don't come closer." The voice was thin, cracked at every edge, but the eyes above it was something else entirely. Dark eyes, steady eyes, eyes that had seen things in the past 3 days that no child's eyes should carry. And in them, not just fear. Fear was there, yes, but beneath it, something that stopped Caleb completely. Determination, the pure, unadorned, unbreakable kind, the kind that doesn't negotiate. Caleb stopped. He stood completely still, and then slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to one knee in the snow, making himself smaller, less threatening, bringing himself to the boy's level with a care that cost him nothing and meant everything. "Where are your folks, son?" Noah's eyes didn't move from him. "They're gone." 2 words, flat, absolute. The wind took them and carried them away, but they left a mark on the air where they had been. Caleb looked at the wagon, at the broken wheel, at the still shape half buried in the drift 20 feet away, at the boy in front of him with his torn coat and his 2 large boots and his bare red hands gripping a stick he probably couldn't feel. He understood, all of it, in an instant. This child had been here alone, for days, in this, keeping his sister alive through nothing but his own will and his own body and a promise he had been given by a dying woman and had no idea how to break. Caleb reached into his coat and found what little he had, jerky, a biscuit. He set them in the snow between them, slowly, without making it a gesture, just placing them there the way you place something important down carefully. The smell reached Noah. His eyes moved to the food, just a flicker, the involuntary response of a body that had been running on almost nothing for 3 days. But he shook his head. "That's yours." The words hit Caleb somewhere deep and quiet, in a place he hadn't felt much of anything for a long time. "Got more back home," he said softly. It wasn't entirely true, but kindness sometimes wears the shape of a simple lie, and those ones God doesn't count. Noah looked at the food for a long moment. Then he stepped forward. He picked up the biscuit with both hands. He broke it, not in half, but into two careful, unequal pieces. He placed the larger piece gently beside Emma, tucking it within reach of her small hands. Then, and only then, he raised the smaller piece to his own mouth. He took one slow, careful bite, chewed it like something precious. Caleb looked away for a moment. He needed a second to collect himself. He moved toward the crate after that, slowly, watching Noah watch him, and when the boy didn't raise the stick again, Caleb knelt beside Emma and lifted the damp, frozen blankets away. The baby was pale. Her lips had a tinge of color that concerned him, but she was breathing, genuinely breathing, with real rhythm. She was still fighting. "Is she going to be okay?" Noah asked. "She's tough, like her brother." Noah was quiet for a moment. He looked down at Emma, then back at Caleb, with those old eyes and that young face. "Do babies stop crying when they die?" The question came out simply, directly, without drama, the way children ask the things that adults spend lifetimes avoiding. Caleb felt it land somewhere below his ribs and stay there. "Sometimes," he said honestly. Noah nodded. "I kept listening," he said, "every night. I was scared of when she'd go quiet." Caleb set the dry blanket, the one he'd untied from behind his saddle, the one he'd been saving for himself, around Emma. He tucked it carefully, the way he imagined a father would. Then he looked at the boy. "I can help you," he said. "You'll take her away from me." Noah's voice was flat. It wasn't an accusation, it was a fear stated plainly, the way children state fears when they've learned that softening them doesn't make them smaller. Caleb met his eyes and held them steadily. "I am not here to take a single thing from you," he said. "I am here to make sure you both live." He paused, "And after that, whatever comes next, you decide." The wind pushed between them. Emma whimpered softly. "Promise?" Noah asked. Out on the Wyoming plains, a promise was not a social nicety. It was not the kind of word you used carelessly and forgot by morning. It was a weight a man chose to pick up and carry, and everyone within earshot understood that. Caleb had made very few promises in his life. He had kept every one of them. He took a slow breath of cold air. "I promise." The stick slipped from Noah's hands and vanished into the snow without a sound. Caleb moved without hesitation after that. He settled Emma against his chest, inside his coat, against his heartbeat, the warmest place he had to offer. Then he turned to Noah, who was already trying to stand straighter, already trying to walk forward under his own power, still trying to carry the weight of the last 3 days on legs that had nearly given out. "I can walk," Noah said. "I know you can," Caleb said, "but you don't have to." He lifted the boy onto the horse, gently, completely, the way you carry something you've decided to be responsible for. Noah settled in front of the saddle, and without being asked, without a word, he leaned forward and wrapped both arms around Emma through the fabric of Caleb's coat. His grip was immediate and absolute, not the grip of exhaustion, the grip of someone who has decided he is never letting go. The ride home was slow. The wind was brutal, pushing against them from every direction, as though the storm resented being navigated. The snow deepened under the horses' hooves. Time moved strangely, too slow in some moments, blurred in others. At one point, Noah's head dropped forward, and Caleb felt the small weight of it settle against his arm, and he held himself very still so the boy could rest without tipping. But even in that half-sleep, Noah's arms didn't loosen, not once, not even close. Caleb noticed. He noticed all of it, and something inside him, something that had been sealed off and quiet for 6 long winters, shifted open, just slightly, like a door that had been stuck for years, finally moving on its hinges. Then through the storm, the house appeared. Warm light in the windows, steady, amber, real. The shape of the barn beyond it, the fence line emerging from the white, the particular, irreplaceable sight of a place where someone has been keeping a fire burning. "That's home," Caleb said quietly. Noah lifted his head. His eyes found the light. And across his face, across that exhausted, ancient 6-year-old face, something moved that had not been there in 3 days. Something cautious and fragile and unmistakable. Hope. Inside, Caleb worked without stopping. He settled Emma near the stove, unwrapped her carefully, assessed her with the practical, unhurried competence of a man who had delivered calves in January and knew what a living thing looked like when it was close to the edge. He warmed water, he found the clean cloth, he got food heating. He wrapped Noah in a dry blanket and put him in the chair closest to the fire and didn't tell him to sleep because he knew the boy wasn't ready, knew that some part of him was still out there on the trail, still listening, still standing guard. So Noah sat by the fire and watched Emma. He watched her chest. He watched the color slowly, gradually return to her face, pink replacing gray, warmth replacing the terrible pallor of cold. He watched her breathing deepen and slow and find a rhythm that was steady and real. And his own breathing, without him noticing, began to match hers, breath for breath, present and alive. Later, much later, when Emma was sleeping soundly and Noah had eaten something warm and the fire had burned down to steady coals, the boy looked up at Caleb across the room. His hands rested in his lap. His eyes were almost too heavy to keep open, but he kept them open one moment longer. "What happens to us now?" he asked. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. At this boy who had stood in a blizzard for 3 days with a stick and a promise and nothing else. At this child who had fed his sister before himself, who had listened through the dark for the sound of her breathing, who had raised a cracked and trembling voice at a stranger twice his size and said, "Don't come closer," because someone small and helpless was behind him. He looked at Emma, sleeping, breathing, alive because her brother had refused, in the cold, in the dark, in the grief, in the absolute exhaustion of 3 impossible days, to let her be anything else. And then Caleb Turner said the only thing there was to say. "You stay," he said, "both of you, for as long as you want." Noah looked at him the way children look at adults when they have learned not to trust words too quickly, searching, reading, measuring the weight of what was said against the face of the man who said it. Then, slowly, he nodded, and he closed his eyes. He slept. For the first time in 3 days and 3 nights, in the warmth, beside his sister, in a house with a fire burning and a man who had made a promise and meant it, Noah Briggs slept. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind tore across the plains, and the snow buried the trail, and the cold pressed against every window. But inside that small house, the fire burned steady. And in the chair beside the stove, a 6-year-old boy breathed slowly, deeply, at last. And in the crate beside him, his baby sister breathed with him, alive, warm, held. And Caleb Turner sat across the room, watching them both in the firelight, and felt something he had not felt in 6 years. He felt like someone was home. He didn't know yet what the coming months would look like. He didn't know about the mornings Noah would wake reaching for a mother who wasn't there, or the nights Emma would cry and Noah would be at her side before Caleb even rose from his chair. He didn't know about the slow, careful process of grief and healing and learning to trust and learning to belong. He didn't know about the spring when Noah would follow him around the ranch with the same focused quiet his father must have had, watching, learning, beginning to love the land the way a boy loves something that has become his own. He didn't know any of that yet, but the promise had already been made. And out here on the Wyoming plains, that was how everything real always began. Not with ceremony, not with words, with a man who chose not to ride past and a boy who chose not to walk away. There are children in this world who carry weight no child should carry, who stand in impossible places and hold on anyway, not because they're fearless, but because someone they love is behind them, and that is reason enough. Noah Briggs didn't know he was brave. He only knew his sister needed him. And sometimes, in this life, that is the whole story. That is everything. If this story found something in you, if it reached a place that doesn't get reached very often, please share it. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that ordinary people do extraordinary things every single day. In the cold, in the quiet, when no one is watching, that is where the truest courage lives. And if Desert Heart has earned a place in your week, please subscribe. Hit that button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. We pour everything we have into bringing you moments like this one, stories that remind you why loyalty matters, why love endures, and why the human heart, even at its most broken, finds a way to keep going. We are so glad you're here. We'll see you next time. This story carries several layers of genuine and lasting value. It reflects the real historical conditions of frontier life in Wyoming in the late 1800s, the genuine danger of winter travel, the isolation of rural families, and the bonds of obligation that formed between strangers on the plains. It illustrates with honesty and dignity that children are capable of profound moral courage, that the instinct to protect and to love is not something that waits for adulthood to arrive. It models what a genuine promise looks like, not a word, but a weight, chosen deliberately and carried without condition. It offers a portrait of grief that is real without being sensational, showing that loss does not always arrive with tears, that sometimes it arrives as a door closing and a child picking up a stick. And it gives older American viewers something they recognize deeply and respond to completely, the image of someone who had every reason to stop and didn't. Not for glory, not for recognition, simply because someone needed them to keep going. That is the story that never gets old. That is the story that will always be true.